This is the final Haftorah of what they call the four portions. These are four unique portions that are added over the period of the 6 weeks before Passover. So this is the fourth. You always read this portion on the Shabbat before the first of Nisan. So Nisan is the month of Passover. Nisan is always the 15th. Passover is the 15th of Nisan. So the first of Nisan is called Shabbat Hachodesh, the Shabbat of the month, because we take out a second Torah and we read about the commandment that God commands Moses and Aaron in Egypt to establish Nisan as the first month of the Jewish calendar, because we have one calendar for years and one calendar for months. So Nisan is the first month. Nisan is the first month. So it's a little bit strange, but our Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, is the first of the 7th month, because we count months differently. We count the year differently and the month differently, but that's for another story. That's for another time. So it's called Shabbat HaChodesh, the Shabbat of the Shabbat of the month, but that piece that we read, which is Exodus chapter 12, we read all about the commandment to prepare the Paschal offering in Egypt and in subsequent years. That's the reading. All the laws of the Pesach offering, how they would take the slaughter the sheep and put the blood on the doorposts, and that's why. And God would pass over the homes that have the doorposts, which that's where the name the holiday gets its name, Passover, etc., etc. Okay, fine. We're not really studying that. We're studying the Haftorah. What Haftorah do we study? So we go back to the book of Yechezkel, of Ezekiel, and we go to the third half of the book, and we find the portion that discusses the offerings of the first of Nisan. Okay, that fits like a glove. First of Nisan, first of Nisan. In the Torah, we read about God speaking to Moses on the first of Nisan and saying, take this month of Nisan and make it the first of the months, and then count 14 days, and on the 14th day, bring the Pesach offering and eat it on the night of the 15th. So we have the equivalent. We have the offerings offered on the first of Nisan, spelled out in the book of Yechezkel, in the book of Ezekiel. Wonderful. That will be enough. We could read the Haftorah and everybody can go home. The problem is that nobody knows what Yechezkel or Ezekiel is talking about, because we have all kinds of offerings that he mentions that the Torah does not mention. He has an offering of the first of Nisan that the Torah doesn't mention. He has an offering on the 7th of Nisan the Torah doesn't mention. He has an offering on the 14th day of Nisan, which is the day that everybody would prepare the Pesach offering, slaughter the Pesach offering, and eat the flesh at night. He has a different offering, a bull instead of a sheep. So it's confusing. Nobody knows what's happening here. So to the extent that at some point they wanted, and there are other problems in the last section of the book of Ezekiel, where certain things that he says seem to contradict the words of the Torah. For example, to the Haftorah of a different parsha, it's an Haftorah within the third book, in the portion of Emor, which discusses the laws of the priests. So there it says that a priest cannot marry a widow. In reality, the Torah says only a high priest can't marry a widow. So there's contradictions. So at some point, the Talmud says the sages wanted to bury the book of Ezekiel because it's contradicting to the Torah. At the end of the day, they didn't bury it. The guy says he went up, sent a sage, he went up to the attic with 300 barrels of oil, which represents a lot of fuel, so he could sit many nights and study and write, and he solved all the problems. The problem is that we don't know what he solved, so we don't really know the answer. So the Talmud says, well, it's a disagreement. One disagreement says, let me just read from the Talmud here. One interpretation, there's 3 interpretations in the Talmud. The first we'll leave the first one for later when we get to that verse. But another interpretation, the second interpretation is, he says, we don't know. When Elijah the prophet comes, he'll solve it. In other words, we have no idea what this verse means. When Mashiach comes, Elijah is the one who will herald, who will tell us that Mashiach is coming, as the verse says on the final page of the prophets, which we're going to read in the Haftorah right before Passover. Elijah will come to notify us about the redemption. So when Elijah comes, when Mashiach comes, he'll explain to us this portion. Okay, that's one interpretation. Another interpretation that the Parsha gives, and this is probably the one that's most accepted, is we're not talking about conventional offerings. We're talking about inauguration offerings. In other words, if you look at the Torah, Actually, in this week's parsha, interesting. In this week's parsha, we read about the commandment that once the tabernacle was established, there was supposed to be 7 days of inauguration. And in those 7 days, the priests were commanded to offer unique offerings. They were called korbanot hamiluim, the offerings of the inauguration. Never again do they offer those offerings. They're unique. When you inaugurate the temple, you bring specific offerings. So the Talmud says the offerings that Ezekiel is talking about in this Haftorah is talking about not every year they would offer these offerings, but specifically the first year when they would inaugurate the temple. Which temple? We believe it's the third temple, not the second temple. The third temple that's going to be rebuilt, because we think that that whole section of Ezekiel is not really talking about the second temple, because when they built the second temple, they did not follow the dimensions of the temple that Ezekiel spells out and that we read about actually last week's Haftorah, if I remember correctly. So we think Ezekiel is talking about the third temple, the future redemption. There are other reasons, other indicators that we're talking about the third temple as well. We'll get to them hopefully. And therefore, these are unique offerings. They're called the offerings of inauguration. And therefore, you can ask, how come these offerings don't appear in the Torah? They don't appear in the Torah because they're one-time unique offerings. So that's how we solve some of the contradictions between the Haftorah and the Torah. Another problem we have here, not a problem, another thing we'll get a description of the third temple, how the Nasi, the prince. Nasi means prince, Nasi means leader. Most people believe it refers to the king, or either a king or the political leader of the Jewish people, how the Nasi would come to the temple and how he would worship and how they would accommodate him in the temple all year on Shabbat and holidays, as well as the 3 pilgrimage holidays. So we're going to learn a lot about how, we're going to hear a little bit about how the technicalities of how the pilgrimage worked and how people entered the temple and exited the temple. And it sounds very technical, just sort of crowd control. But of course, the sages explain that there is a lot to learn, and there are messages here that we can derive from the description that we give about how the order of the pilgrimage was within the temple. So that's by way of introduction. Enough introductions. We're going to go straight into the reading. If anybody has any comments, questions on what I said so far, please jump in. Otherwise, we open up the book of Ezekiel, which is the Haftorah of this week, and we'll share the screen. But if you have your own book, it begins Ezekiel chapter 45.
Rabbi, it talks about Yechezkel and Shmuel, so I may have missed at the beginning that you said something about that or not.
Shmuel, where do you see Shmuel?
At the top of the page for...
Oh, it happens to be...
Because it's combined?
No, it happens to be that this Shabbat is also Erev Rosh Chodesh. It's the day before the new month. It's the day before the new month. So if it wouldn't be the Shabbat Hachodesh, if it wouldn't be the last one of the 4 portions, we would read a standard Haftorah for the day before Rosh Chodesh from the book of Samuel. I don't know. We discussed it once in the series this year, but I don't remember. But in any case, a year like this, where you have 2 special occasions, it's also Shabbat HaChodesh, plus it's the day before the new month. What you do is you read the Haftorah of HaChodesh, but then you also read the first and last verse of the Haftorah of the day preceding Rosh Chodesh. So you don't read the whole thing, but you just read the first and last verse, just sort of to remember. So if we have time, maybe we'll touch upon the first and last verse, even though that's a fascinating Haftorah. David and Jonathan, I don't remember if we did it. It could be we did, I don't remember. But in any case, so that's why you see the book of Samuel. If you scroll down, I'll scroll down here. So you have Ezekiel chapter 45, Ezekiel chapter 46, and then you go to the book of Samuel, chapter 20, Samuel 1, chapter 20, verse 18, and then you skip to chapter 20, verse 42. First and last verse, the short version, otherwise we'll be here all day, And no, I'm kidding. Yeah, it's a short version. Okay, so we'll jump right in. No time to waste. Don't hesitate to stop me. So says the Lord God. So again, Ezekiel, the book of Ezekiel. Who is Ezekiel? Ezekiel was a prophet who lived at the end of the period of the first temple. He prophesies about the destruction of the first temple, similar to Jeremiah. He also was exiled to Babylonia, and some of his prophecies happen in Babylonia. And so a lot of his book is very sad, I would say, or rebuke. The end of the book, I believe from chapter 40 and on, it's upbeat. It talks about the future. It talks about how the God will return to the temple and how the Jerusalem will be rebuilt. God will return to the temple and the service in the temple will be restored. As I mentioned, we believe that the details of his description are referring not to the coming back after the Babylonian exile 70 years later, but it's the future redemption. And we have a few reasons to indicate that, but we'll leave that for another time. So Ezekiel chapter 45, verse 18. So says the Lord God. So what happened before verse 18? What happened at the beginning of the chapter? At the beginning of the chapter, the Torah, the prophet establishes the position of the Nasi, of the leader. And you can call him a king or you can call him a political leader, depending on what you think the political leadership will look like in the Messianic era. But he's the leader. He's the leader of the Jewish people. He is going to have, but what happens is also, this is different than what the Torah describes. The way the Torah describes it is that, how do they pay for the offerings? They would pay, everybody would give a half coin, and they would take the half coin and buy the daily offerings and the communal offerings. In the description in Ezekiel, no, everybody gives their coin to the prince, to the leader, and the leader pays for the offerings. That's another thing that's different in the Torah. In the end of the Haftorah, it also tries to establishes the position of the king. Basically, he has his lot, he has certain advantages, but what he cannot do is he cannot take the land away from other people. So it's not in the Haftorah, but in the context of what's happening here is Ezekiel is trying to set aside a role for the leader, both a political leader, but also a spiritual role for that leader. As we will see when he comes to the temple, he has certain privileges. However, it limits those privileges. It limits his ability to take away other people's land for eminent domain and other reasons. And that's not in the Haftorah, but it's in the section right after the Haftorah. So it's always walking the balance between the balance of power between the king, how much power the king has, and how we limit the king's power to abuse the power. Okay, in any case, so says the Lord God, in the first month, on the first of the month. Stop right here. This is why we read the Haftorah. Why? Because this is we always read this additional portion of Hachodesh on the first of Nisan. Okay, verse 18 says the first month on the first of the month, first of Nisan. Okay, everything else beyond this is wonderful. It's cherry on the top, but we already know why we read it. Okay, fine. So you shall take a young bull without blemish, and you shall purify the sanctuary. So offer a young bull. Nowhere in the Torah does it say that the first of Nisan you offer a young bull, but okay. Now, and the priest shall take the blood of the sin offering and put it on the doorpost of the house, and on the four corners of the ledge of the altar, and on the doorpost of the gate of the inner court. Okay, stop right here. Nowhere in the Torah do we hear a law like this, that you slaughter the blood. Usually you slaughter the animal, you take the blood, and you put the blood on the altar. That's what you do. You sprinkle blood on the altar. But nowhere do you take the blood and put it on the doorposts of the temple. Since when do you put blood on the doorposts of the temple? So this is unusual. So this is only in the inauguration process. But there are those who say, what does this remind us of? Putting blood on the doorposts. Somebody jump in, help me out. What does this remind you of? Passover offering, because the Passover offering was the only one in Egypt that they would take the blood and put it on the doorposts. So you see that relationship with Passover, and many say that, again, when we're coming back to the temple after the exile, it's like the beginning of the redemption. So we're doing, again, what the Jewish people did in Egypt when they began their process of redemption. So they're replicating that ritual, so to speak. Okay, so verse 20. And so shall you do on the 7 days. This is already a interpretation. In the Hebrew, it says, B'shiva b'chodesh, on the 7th day of the month. They're explaining all 7 days, because in the Torah, the inauguration period is 7 days, so they want Ezekiel to be talking about 7 days. But that's only one opinion. Another opinion, it says the 7th day. Because of the mistaken and simple-minded men, and expiate the house. In other words, the offerings are here to purify of mistakes. If someone makes a mistake, the offerings in the temple purify for that. Okay. Now he goes to Passover, 21, on the first of the 14th day of the month, in the first on the 14th day of the month. So it's the first month on the 14th day of the month. Shall you have Passover, a festival of 7 days. Unleavened bread shall you be eaten. Beautiful. So this is the 14th day. I don't want to get too technical here, but it's very interesting. We call Passover, what is Passover? Passover starts the night of the 15th and on. And the night before, the night of the Seder, is the beginning of the 15th. But in the Bible, that's not what Passover is. The holiday of Passover is the 14th, the day before Passover, what we call Erev Pesach, Pesach Eve, the day before Pesach. Why? Because when did they offer the Passover offering? When did they slaughter the offering? In the afternoon of the 14th. So in the Torah, the holiday of Passover is one day, it's 14th when you bring the Passover. What we call Passover, the Torah calls the holiday of matzot, the holiday of unleavened bread. So it's interesting. Here also, in verse 21, he says, on the 14th day of the month, which is the day you offer the Passover, you shall have the Passover. He says, Yelachem Pesach, it should be Passover for you. So that's similar to the Torah. And then after that, after the 14th, 7 days you don't eat matzah. Okay, now, 22, and the prince, meaning the leader, the Nasi, the leader, on that day, and the prince shall make on that day for himself and for all the people of Israel a bull for a sin offering. Again, where does this come from? Nobody knows. But again, that's why we're going to say this is the inauguration of the third temple. There are unique offerings. Okay. After that, on the 7 days of the festival, he shall make a burnt offering to the Lord, 7 bulls and 7 rams without blemish, daily for 7 days, and a sin offering, a he-goat daily. Verse 24, and a meal offering he shall make an ephah for a bull and an ephah for a ram, and for each ephah 1 bin of oil. As we know, in the offerings in the temple, the musaf offerings, the additional offerings, when you brought an animal, you also brought flour, what they call a meal offering, as well as oil. So it tells you exactly how much flour to bring for every offering. And then 25, in the 7th month, on the 15th day of the month, what we call Sukkot, right? It's the 7th month, the 15th day of the 7th month. He shall do the same for 7 days, a similar sin offering and a similar burnt offering, a similar meal offering, and similar oil. Okay, fine, beautiful. That's the end of chapter 25. What do we know? What's the takeaway? We know that beginning on the first day of the first month, when they celebrate the inauguration of the third temple, the prince brings unique offerings. That's 25. That's verse 45. Now we get to verse 46. The verse 46 is a description of when the Nasi, when the prince comes to the temple, when he comes in the weekday and when he comes on the holidays and the new months on Rosh Chodesh, as well as when everybody else comes in the pilgrimage holidays. So that's the beginning of chapter 46. So far, so good. Nobody is asking any questions. That means so far it's relatively clear. Okay, when you climb the Temple Mountain, you're going from east to west. In other words, the innermost chamber is the Holy of Holies was on the west. So we're going to talk about the eastern gate, the eastern opening, the eastern entrance is the main entrance. Now we have the western wall. The western wall was the wall behind the Holy of Holies, not part of the actual structure, but it's the wall behind. So we're sort of standing behind the temple. Now we believe that the holiness was gradual, and the more west you went, the more holy it was. But the entrance of the temple was the eastern entrance. I'm only saying it because we're going to be talking about the eastern entrance right now. So verse 1, so says the Lord God, the gate of the inner court that faces toward the east shall remain closed for 6 working days. But on the Shabbat it shall be opened, and on the new moon it shall be opened. So the description is you come to the temple is a structure. Now, the main entrance is closed during the week. It's only open on holidays and on the days of the new month, of Rosh Chodesh, the new month. The other days, you can enter from the side entrances. What does that represent? That represents a few things. It represents that the temple is separate and apart. It's a holy experience. You cannot access it in the weekday. In other words, you have to be elevated before you can enter the temple. There's a separation between the holiness and the mundane, and therefore the door is closed. You can't get in symbolically. On Shabbat, it's open. On Rosh Chodesh, it's open. Okay. And the prince shall enter by the way of the vestibule of the gate without, and he shall stand at the doorpost of the gates. And the priest shall offer his burnt offering and his peace offering, and he shall prostrate himself at the threshold of the gate and go out. But the gate shall not be closed until the evening. So this is referring to, give me just a second, I'm going to confirm so I don't tell you something that's wrong. Okay, so according to the commentary I'm reading, we're referring to even on the holidays. Even on the holidays, when the prince would come, he would come to the main entrance and he would wait, but he wouldn't enter, but he would just wait there. And the people of the land, meaning everybody else, the common people, verse 3, and the people of the land shall also prostrate themselves at the entrance of the gate on the Shabbat and on the new moon before the Lord. In other words, the priest comes to the main entrance, which is opened, but he doesn't enter. He just stands at the opening and he watches that's the prince, the leader. And then he watches the priests offering his offerings. And anybody else can also come to where the prince is standing, to where the Nasi is standing, show up to the door, the open main door, and they could prostrate themselves, but they cannot enter. And then verse 4, we talk about the offering that the prince would offer on Shabbat, on the special occasions. And the burnt offering which the priest offers to the Lord on the Shabbat shall be 6 lambs without blemish and a ram without blemish, and a meal offering, 1 ephah for the ram and for the lambs, a meal offering as he is able to give, and a bin of oil to 1 ephah. Okay. And on the new moon, in other words, on Rosh Chodesh, a young bull without blemish and 6 lambs and a ram without blemish are they to be. This is also a problem because these offerings are very similar to the way the Torah mentions, but the Torah says you should have 7 lambs, not 6 lambs. So what does that mean? So that's what I said. There's different opinions. One opinion is that it's telling you a law. And interesting, the first opinion that I skipped before was that if you don't have 7, you can offer 6. That's what Ezekiel is teaching us. But again, others say either Elijah will solve this puzzle or it was unique. It was just specific for that unique time. In any case, going back to the prince in verse 8, and whenever the prince goes in, he shall go in by the way of the vestibule of the gates, and by the same way he shall go out. When the priests comes to the temple, when the prince, meaning the leader, he can go in to the main entrance and come out through the main entrance. And verse 9 is very interesting. Everybody else, in other words, the common people, when they come 3 times a year to the temple on the pilgrimage holiday, they don't go through the main entrance. They go through the side entrances on the north and the south. But what's interesting is you're not allowed to go out on the same door you came in. If you came in from the north gate, you go out from the south gate. If you come in from the south gate, you go out from the north gate. Only the prince in verse 8 could enter the main gate and then come and exit the same way he came from. Everybody else on the pilgrimage holidays has to go. You have to cross. Don't go out the same day the same way you come in. That's verse 9. We'll read that in a moment. And verse 10 is also very interesting, that on the pilgrimage holidays, when everybody is there and everybody else is entering and going in from one gate and out the other gates, then the prince has to be amongst them. In other words, in the pilgrimage holidays, he's not allowed to go in from the main entrance and go out in the same way he comes in. That's only on the other occasions. But when everybody else is there, he has to mingle with everybody and he has to be like everybody else. So we're going to talk about that when we finish the reading here. We'll get back to this verse, but it's interesting, verse 9. But when the people of the land come before the Lord on the times fixed for meeting, which is Moadim, holidays, he who enters by the way of the north gate to prostrate himself shall go out by the way of the south gate. And he that enters by way of the south gate shall go out by the way of the north gate. He shall not return by way of the gate whereby he came in, but he shall go out by that which is opposite it. Verse 10, the prince also then enters among them when they go in, and when they go out, they, the prince and the people together, go out. In other words, on the pilgrimage holidays, the prince enters with the people, with the common people, and goes out with the common people. Verse 11, and on the fire and on the festivals and on the times fixed for meeting, the meal offering shall consist of an ephah for a bull and an ephah for a ram, but for the lambs a gift which is in accordance with his means, and oil a hin of the ephah. So again, we're jumping back between to the various offerings of the leader. Verse 12, and when the prince brings a free will offering, a burnt offering or peace offering as free will offering to the Lord, in other words, when he's not obligated to bring an offering, but he chooses and selects to, one shall then open for him the gate that faces east, and he shall bring his burnt offering and his peace offering as he does on the Shabbat day. And after he has gone out, one shall close the gate. He is considered important and unique, and therefore the priest, when the prince would in the weekday would bring his offerings, they would make a special accommodation and open the east gate for him. But again, he wouldn't enter, and when he left, they would close it. Verse 12, and a lamb of the first year without blemish shall you bring as a burnt offering daily to the Lord. Every morning shall you bring it. And as a meal offering, you shall bring for it every morning a sixth of the ephah and a third of a hin of oil to stir with the fine flour, a meal offering to the Lord according to the perpetual ordinance. Thus shall they bring the lamb and the meal offering and the oil every morning, a continual burnt offering. This is wonderful because that says in the Torah as well. It's not the full picture because the Torah talks about the afternoon offering and it's not mentioned here explicitly. So this is an overview of what the verses are saying. And I'm going to give you a few moments of interpretation of what this what the meaning is and what the message Ezekiel is giving us. So we will do that for a few moments, and then we will see if we want to take any questions or if we have a moment for Rosh Chodesh, for the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh. We shall see. Okay, let's begin with something interesting. Let's begin with the technical thing in verse 9, which I think is quite interesting. So verse 9. First thing we want to talk about in verse 9. So when the common people would come to the temple, if you enter through the north, you leave through the south. If you enter through the south, you leave through the north. You don't enter, you do not return by way of the gate whereby he came in, but he shall go out by the way which is opposite it. So I did not know this till this morning, but I read this morning that is the source of the custom, that when we, in our sanctuary, in our temple, when we pray, when we bring the Torah scroll from the ark to the table where they read the Torah. So when you bring the Torah from the ark to the table, you go one way, and when you come back, you go the other way. In other words, you go on the right side from the ark to the Torah, and you return on the left side. You make a full circle. I didn't know this, but it's commemorating that which they did. That's what they will do, I guess, in the future when Ezekiel, as described in this week's Haftorah in Ezekiel. So that was interesting. Now, why is this so important? We make the point. The prince shows up. He can come and he can enter and exit the same gates, but nobody else can, and the common people cannot. And also, to the extent that on the holidays, when all the common people are there, the prince should actually be with the common people and should not enter and exit the same gate, but it should go in from the north, but enter from one and go out from the other. So there are a few interpretations. The one interpretation is from the Yavitz, who was a commentator probably 400 years ago, and he says, look, you come to the temple. The purpose of the temple is you make a beautiful structure. People should be in awe of the presence of God. You build a temple and people are like overwhelmed by this experience. So you want to keep people in awe. This is a very practical thing. If I enter and I exit at the same door, then I'm already comfortable with this surrounding. I already know where I'm going, right? He says, I'm coming to the temple for the first time this year. It's actually the experience is more awe-inspiring and new when there's mystery, when I don't know what to expect. So we want that entire process of entering the temple and exiting the temple should be a constant awakening of emotions of how extraordinary this space is. But it can only happen if you maintain the idea of the freshness and the newness. And I'm not comfortable with with my surroundings, because then I lose the sense of awe. So that's a practical interpretation. But then the other later commentaries expand this idea, and they say, what does it mean that I come in from the door and I walk out the same door I came in? In some sense, that represents I showed up, I served God, whatever it is, but then I go back to my old habits. I have not changed. Yes, it's an extraordinary experience. I come, I do something extraordinary, but then I go back the same door I came out. Going back the same door I come into represents I'm retreating. So I make an advance and I retreat. But the Torah says, no, the experience of coming to the temple has to be transformational. And that is expressed in the way that I do not leave the temple the same way I came in. I am not the same person. Because the purpose of going to the temple on the pilgrimage holiday is not to create a spiritual moment, a spiritual experience in the temple. It's to change me, that when I go home, I'm now a transformed person. I am more spiritual, more holy, more refined, more kind, etc., etc. I'm not the same person. If I'm the same person, then the whole trip was a waste of time. And the commentators say that's really the message of do not leave the same door you came into. So I thought that was beautiful and worth repeating, because that's the idea of serving God. We don't come to the temple to find a moment of holiness, but the idea is, can I take that moment of holiness and bring it home and transform myself? On the other hand, so we have this balance between the leader. Okay, so that's the first point. Fine. Now we'll go a little Kabbalistic. I got to give you a little sprinkle of Kabbalah.
Rabbi, like from the point of view of like socializing, if you have to cross, then you have to meet other people. Does anybody talk about that?
I don't know, because I guess you should socialize in the bed and breakfast in Jerusalem. I don't know if you should socialize in the temple. The temple is a place of serving God, right? So I guess
see other people too.
Could be. I have not seen it, but again, the fact that I have not seen it is not proof that it doesn't exist. They say lo ra'inu ein raya. They're saying I have not seen is not a proof. So I say I have not seen it, but that's not proof that it doesn't exist, and that it has not been said. And if it has not been said, it doesn't mean you can't say it. You can still say it. So again, it's a comfort zone. I come in, I say hi to people around me. I'm comfortable in this area. Come to the temple, this area, I like the people here, I'm comfortable, right? But I got to move. I'm constantly on the move. You can't be stationary. You can't stay in the place that you're comfortable. You have to cross the entire chamber, meet other people, see the new experience. That's one interpretation. The other interpretation is the main thing, if you look at verse 9, the main emphasis is, he says, if you come from the north, you should go out by the way of the south. But then the emphasis is, he shall not return by the way of the gate whereby he came in. That's the key. Don't go out the same way you came in. Okay, when I say that, don't go out the same way you come in, that sounds like you got to change. You can't be the same on the way out, the way you are on the way in.
Yeah, that's beautiful. But I think the first one kind of in line with what I said, you have to feel like part of the community, right?
Very good. Okay, a little Kabbalah here for a moment. A little Kabbalah. We have this conversation that in chapter 46, verse 1, so says the Lord God, I'm reading chapter 46, verse 1, so says the Lord God, the gate of the inner court that faces inward toward the east shall remain closed for 6 working days, but on a Shabbat it shall be opened, on the new moon it shall be opened. What happens? What are we saying? We're saying it is the main entrance to the temple, eastern gate. It faces east. It's closed all week. Shabbat, it's opened. Says the Kabbalah, Hasidic philosophy in particular, says, look, it's not just a technical door. When the door is closed to the temple, it's a reflection of a spiritual reality. So there's a specific level that is, in other words, there's a specific feeling of holiness that is not accessible during the week. But on Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh, when that door is open, remember, nobody can come in from that door. You're not supposed to go in from that door, right? Even the priests, even the Nasi, the prince, would walk up to the door, prostrate, and then leave, but he wouldn't enter that door. So why is it open if it can't enter? What's the purpose of the open doors? So the open doors represents that the holiness of the temple is accessible. And according to the Kabbalah, this is the way it works. The word kadim, the word east, also means early, kodem, before, right? Why? Because when you see the sun is coming from the east. So it has been east before it came to you, right? So the Hebrew word for kedem, earlier, kadim, is east. It's the same word for early and east. So what we're going to say is, what the Kabbalah says is that the opening to the temple, the inner opening, he says, the opening to the inner chamber, that represents the inner recesses of the Jew's soul. And what is in the inner recesses in the Jewish soul? That's sort of from before, in other words, subconscious, before anything else that happens to it. What is at the core of the soul? The core of the soul is love to God. But all week, that door is closed, just like the temple doors are closed. That natural love to God is closed off, much harder to access. So what has to happen during the first 7 days, 6 days of the week? There, you have to work to be able to access the love. And even the love that you're going to access is not the same love. You have to work through meditation. I meditate, I think about the greatness of God, and the meditation produces a love that's a result of the meditation. That's during the 6 days of the week. What happens Shabbat? Shabbat, you don't have to do that. Shabbat, the doors open, the doors to the temple open. What does it mean, doors to the temple open? Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh. What does it mean, the doors to the temple open? The doors to the inner chambers of the Jew's soul open. And now you have a love, not a love that's based on logic, just like the love that we produce through meditation during the 6 days of the week, but a natural love, the love that's kadim, very early, the primordial love, the love that we have in our core and our essence, and that is accessible on Shabbat and on the holidays, and on Rosh Chodesh and on the holidays. And that's the Kabbalistic interpretation of the closed door and the open door, that on Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh, the door is open. Which door? The door to the inner chamber, and the door is open because that's a reflection of the spiritual reality, that it's much easier to access our core on Shabbat. And when we access our core, we don't have to create the love through meditation. And in that sense, the love is a creation of the mind, but the love becomes, the love that we can tap into on Shabbat is the essential love of the soul to God, like a parent and a child. So a child could have love to the parent by meditating. Oh, my parent did so much good for me. My parent gave me the credit card. My parent paid for my education. That's love that comes from logic. But then there's the love that a person feels, the essential bond. The children don't always feel it. They feel it maybe once a year, maybe once a lifetime. But you can access that essential love. And when you do, you don't have to meditate and say, wow, here's the shopping list. Here's what they did for me, and that's why I love them. No, the love is essential. So that open door on Shabbat and holidays represent that our heart is opened. In other words, we can access the subconscious love to God. It doesn't mean we don't have to work to access it. We have to work to access it, but it's available. It's available. During the 6 days of the week, it's not available. You have to, so the love that we produce during the 6 days of the week is a love that is the product of the conscious mind. It's a love that's a product of meditation. On Shabbat, we get to the love that's the essential love. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in short about the Haftorah of Shabbat Hachodesh. There's more to say. Of course, there's more to say also about the day of before Rosh Chodesh. Maybe we'll say that for another time when we do the full Haftorah of Shabbat of before Rosh Chodesh. I hope this was somewhat interesting, even though there's more questions than answers on this Haftorah. But it's always good to at least grapple with the questions and hopefully take away a little bit of inspiration. So thank you all for joining, and have a wonderful day, and see you soon in good health, God willing.
Thank you very much.